January 1993. Audrey Hepburn died at her home in Switzerland. She was 63 years old, surrounded by her 2 sons and her partner, Robert Wolders. But there was one person who wasn't there. Someone who had been by her side for 40 years. Someone who knew her better than almost anyone. Someone who, according to those close to them, might have been the true love of her life. Hubert de Givenchy, the man who dressed Audrey, the man who created her image, the man who never married, never had a serious relationship with anyone else, and dedicated his entire career to making one woman look beautiful. When Givenchy learned of Audrey's death, he locked himself in his Paris apartment for 3 days. He wouldn't see anyone, wouldn't take calls, just sat alone with photographs of Audrey wearing his designs. His assistant later said, "I'd never seen him cry before, but that day, he was destroyed." For 40 years, from 1953 until Audrey's death in 1993, Hubert de Givenchy and Audrey Hepburn had a relationship that defied definition. More than friendship, more than professional collaboration, but never quite crossing into romance. Or did it? Hollywood wants you to believe their relationship was purely professional, that they were just a designer and his muse. But the truth is far more complicated, far more intimate, and far more tragic than anyone admits. This is the story of 2 people who loved each other deeply, but never became lovers. The story of what happens when society, timing, and circumstance prevent 2 souls from being together. And the story of a love so powerful that it lasted 40 years without ever being consummated. February 1953. A young actress named Audrey Hepburn walked into Hubert de Givenchy's Paris atelier. She was 23 years old, still relatively unknown, about to start filming Sabrina. Givenchy was 25, just 2 years older, and already an emerging star in the fashion world. He'd opened his own house just 18 months earlier and was building a reputation for elegant, revolutionary designs. But there was a problem. Givenchy thought he was meeting Katharine Hepburn. His assistant had told him Miss Hepburn was coming for a costume consultation. Givenchy assumed it was the famous, established Katharine. Instead, a thin young woman with short hair and enormous eyes walked through his door. Givenchy later described that moment. "I was disappointed at first. I was very busy, and I thought I was meeting this great star. Instead, here was this girl I'd barely heard of. But then something happened. Something neither of them expected. They started talking. About design, about aesthetics, about what Audrey wanted for the film. And within minutes, Givenchy realized this wasn't just another actress looking for costumes. She understood, he later said. She understood what I was trying to do with design. She saw clothes the way I did, not as decoration, but as expression. Within 10 minutes, I knew I wanted to work with her." For Audrey's part, she felt an instant connection. After years of feeling awkward about her appearance, too thin, too boyish by Hollywood standards, here was someone who saw her differently. Givenchy looked at her body and saw elegance, grace, possibility. He pulled several pieces from his current collection: a simple black dress, a white shirt with a cinched waist, a fitted evening gown. None of them were designed specifically for her, but when Audrey put them on, they transformed. Givenchy's assistant, who was in the room, later recalled, "Monsieur Givenchy's entire demeanor changed. He circled her, adjusting the fabric, completely absorbed. I'd seen him dress hundreds of women, but this was different. He was seeing something. They spent hours together that first day. Not just fitting clothes, but talking about art, about their childhoods. Both had difficult relationships with their mothers, about what they wanted from life. When Audrey finally left, Givenchy stood at the window, watching her walk away. His assistant asked if he would work with her. His response, "I think I just met someone very important." He had no idea how prophetic those words were. Sabrina changed everything, not just for Audrey's career, but for the nature of her relationship with Givenchy. The film required Audrey's character to transform from a chauffeur's daughter into an elegant woman. Givenchy's designs made that transformation visual and unforgettable. But during the filming and fittings, something else was transforming. The relationship between designer and actress. They began spending time together outside of work. Dinners in Paris, long conversations about life and art, quiet evenings where Givenchy would sketch while Audrey read. Givenchy's friends noticed he was different around Audrey, softer, more animated. He laughed more with her than with anyone else. Fashion designer Valentino, who knew Givenchy well, later said, "Hubert was always reserved, almost cold with most people. But with Audrey, he became warm, playful even. She brought out something in him that no one else could reach." For Audrey, Givenchy represented something she'd never had: unconditional acceptance. He never criticized her appearance, never tried to change her. He designed for who she was, not who Hollywood wanted her to be. But there was a complication. Audrey was engaged to actor James Hansen at the time. And even after that engagement ended, she quickly became involved with Mel Ferrer. Givenchy never expressed romantic interest openly, not because he didn't feel it. Those close to him insist he did. But because he was deeply private, and because circumstances never aligned, still, the intimacy between them was undeniable. The way he touched her when adjusting a dress, the way she looked at him with complete trust. The hours they spent alone together, talking about everything except what they might mean to each other. Edith Head, the Paramount costume designer who officially received credit for Sabrina's costumes, noticed something. She later wrote in her memoir, "The clothes Givenchy designed for Audrey in that film weren't just costumes. They were love letters. Every seam, every line was designed to make her beautiful. Not beautiful by general standards, but beautiful specifically for her. That's not how you dress someone you're merely working with." When Sabrina was released in 1954, Audrey became a global fashion icon overnight. And the world credited Givenchy's designs for a significant part of that transformation. Their professional partnership was established. But so was something deeper that neither of them would ever quite name. Throughout the 1950s, Audrey and Givenchy developed a pattern that would define their relationship for decades. Whenever Audrey was in Paris, she would visit Givenchy's atelier. Not for business, though they always discussed her upcoming films, but simply to be together. They'd have tea, they'd talk, and Givenchy would design for her, not for any specific purpose, but because he loved seeing her in his creations. Friends observed something curious. Both of them seemed content with this arrangement. Neither pushed for more. Neither acknowledged what seemed obvious to everyone around them. Why? Several factors seem to have been at play. Factor 1. Timing. During the 1950s, Audrey was married to Mel Ferrer. As we explored in our previous video, that marriage was toxic and controlling. But Audrey was committed to it, partly because of her Catholic upbringing and partly because leaving seemed impossible. Givenchy would never have interfered with Audrey's marriage. He was too respectful of boundaries, too proper in his sensibilities. Factor 2. Sexuality. There's been much speculation about Givenchy's sexuality. He never publicly discussed his personal life, never married, never had a known romantic relationship with anyone, male or female. Some have suggested he was gay and closeted. Others believe he was asexual. Still others think his love for Audrey was so consuming that he simply never wanted anyone else. Fashion historian Amy Fine Collins, who knew Givenchy, offered this perspective. Hubert's relationship with Audrey transcended conventional categories. Whether it was romantic love, platonic devotion, or something in between, doesn't matter. What matters is that it was real, it was deep, and it defined both their lives. Factor 3. The pedestal Givenchy may have loved the idea of Audrey more than he wanted the reality of a relationship. By keeping her at a slight distance, she remained perfect. His muse, his inspiration, his ideal. A relationship with all its complications might have shattered that ideal. And for an artist like Givenchy, that ideal was precious. But despite these barriers, the intimacy continued to deepen. In 1956, during the filming of Funny Face, Givenchy spent weeks in Paris designing Audrey's wardrobe. They worked together daily, often late into the night. Director Stanley Donen noticed. You could feel the connection between them. The way Hubert looked at Audrey when she wore his designs, it was like he was seeing something sacred. And Audrey trusted him completely. She'd wear anything he created, without question. One evening during that shoot, Givenchy took Audrey to his private workshop, a space he rarely showed anyone. He showed her sketches he'd never produced, design ideas too avant-garde for clients. He told her, "I can show you these because you understand. You see what I'm trying to express." Audrey later told her friend Connie Wald, "When I'm with Hubert, I feel seen, really seen. Not as an actress or an image, but as myself." That kind of mutual recognition is rare, and it bound them together more tightly than any conventional relationship might have. 1960. Audrey was offered the role of Holly Golightly in Breakfast at Tiffany's. The film would become her most iconic role, and Givenchy's costumes would become some of the most famous designs in cinema history. But the creation of those costumes revealed just how deep the connection between Audrey and Givenchy had become. For the famous opening scene, Holly eating breakfast outside Tiffany's, Givenchy designed the black dress that would define an era. Simple, elegant, timeless. But here's what most people don't know. Givenchy designed that dress specifically to communicate something about Audrey herself, not just the character. According to his notes, preserved in the Givenchy archives, he wrote, "For Audrey, to show her grace, her solitude, her strength wrapped in vulnerability." This wasn't costume design. This was a portrait of the woman he loved, expressed through fabric and form. During the fittings, something significant happened. Audrey was going through a difficult time. Her marriage to Mel Ferrer was deteriorating. She'd recently suffered another miscarriage, and she was emotionally fragile. One afternoon in Givenchy's atelier, while being fitted for the black dress, Audrey broke down crying. The stress, the grief, the exhaustion, it all came out. Givenchy's assistant started to leave the room to give them privacy. But Givenchy gently held Audrey, letting her cry against his shoulder. For nearly an hour, they stayed like that. No words, just presence. His assistant later said, "I understood then, whatever their relationship was, and I still don't have words for it. It was love. Maybe not romantic love, maybe something deeper, but definitely love." When Breakfast at Tiffany's premiered in 1961, the black dress became instantly iconic. Fashion magazines called it the dress of the decade. Women everywhere wanted to look like Audrey in that dress. But at the premiere, Givenchy's focus wasn't on the audience's reaction. It was on Audrey. Watching her on screen, wearing his creation, embodying everything he found beautiful in the world. A photographer captured a moment at the after-party. Givenchy standing in the background, watching Audrey talk with other guests. The look on his face was unmistakable. That photo has been analyzed by body language experts. Their conclusion? A man looking at the person he loves, knowing she's forever out of reach. The 1960s represented the peak of Audrey and Givenchy's collaboration, and the deepest period of their emotional connection. They worked together on film after film. Charade, 1963. Paris When It Sizzles, 1964. How to Steal a Million, 1966. Each collaboration brought them closer. But more significant than the professional work was their personal relationship. By the mid-1960s, they had developed rituals. When Audrey was in Paris, she would have breakfast at Givenchy's apartment every Sunday. When Givenchy traveled to wherever Audrey was filming, he would bring her flowers from his Paris garden. They exchanged letters constantly when apart. Letters that, according to Audrey's son Luca, were deeply personal and affectionate. These letters have never been made public. Givenchy kept Audrey's letters locked in a private safe. After his death, they were not included in the estate sale. The family has never disclosed their contents, but those who have seen them, including Givenchy's close friend and executor, describe them as intimate without being romantic, revealing without being explicit, the kind of letters you write to someone who knows your soul. During this period, Audrey's marriage to Mel Ferrer finally ended. She divorced him in 1968. For the first time in 14 years, she was free. And Givenchy? He was still unmarried, still seemingly unattached to anyone else, still designing primarily for Audrey, even as his fashion house grew more successful. Friends wondered, would they finally acknowledge what seemed obvious? Would they become something more than this undefined relationship? But it didn't happen. Even after Audrey's divorce, they maintained the same pattern. Close, intimate, but never crossing that final line. Why? Designer Valentino, who discussed this with Givenchy years later, said, "Hubert told me that what he had with Audrey was too precious to risk. A romantic relationship might fail, might end in hurt and distance. But what they had, this deep friendship, this creative partnership, this mutual devotion, that was forever. He didn't want to lose it." Perhaps Givenchy was right. Perhaps by never becoming lovers, they ensured they'd never become exes. They'd never have the bitterness, the disappointment, the end that romance so often brings. But there's also a tragic element. Two people who clearly loved each other, who brought out the best in each other, who might have been extraordinarily happy together. choosing not to try because the risk seemed too great. In 1969, Audrey married Italian psychiatrist Andrea Dotti. The marriage produced her second son, Luca, but was troubled by Dotti's infidelities. Givenchy attended the wedding. He smiled. He congratulated them. And then he returned to Paris and, according to his staff, seemed quietly sad for weeks. But he never stopped designing for Audrey, never stopped being available whenever she needed him, never stopped being the one constant in her life that never disappointed. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, as Audrey largely retired from acting to focus on motherhood and eventually UNICEF work, Givenchy remained her closest confidant. When she traveled for UNICEF, she wore only Givenchy. When she needed a dress for a special occasion, she called Givenchy. When she needed someone to talk to, she called Givenchy. After Audrey's marriage to Dotti ended in 1982, she began a relationship with Robert Wolders. Wolders was kind, supportive, and secure enough to understand Audrey's unique bond with Givenchy. Wolders later said, "I knew Hubert would always be in Audrey's life. That was non-negotiable. And I was fine with it because I could see what they meant to each other. It wasn't a threat to our relationship. It was something else entirely." During the 1980s, as Audrey devoted herself to UNICEF work, Givenchy supported her completely. He designed her UNICEF wardrobe, simple, elegant pieces that commanded respect without overshadowing her humanitarian message. And he donated to her causes, used his fashion house platform to raise awareness for the issues Audrey cared about, showed up at her UNICEF events and sat quietly in the audience, watching her speak, proud of who she'd become. Friends who observed them during this period say they'd achieved something rare, a relationship that was entirely theirs, defined by no one else's rules or expectations. Fashion journalist Susie Menkes, who knew both of them, wrote, "Audrey and Givenchy had what so many romantic relationships lack: absolute trust, unconditional support, and freedom from possession. Perhaps that's the highest form of love." In late 1992, Audrey was diagnosed with a rare form of appendiceal cancer. The prognosis was poor. She had, at most, a few months to live. She was in Switzerland, at her home in Tolochenaz, preparing for the end. Givenchy visited her multiple times during those final months. Their conversations during those visits have never been fully disclosed, but those present described them as deeply emotional. Audrey's son Luca later revealed, "Hubert would sit with my mother for hours. Sometimes they'd talk. Sometimes they'd just hold hands in silence. There was such peace between them, such understanding." During one visit in December 1992, Givenchy brought Audrey a gift, a simple white dress he'd designed specifically for her. Not for any occasion, not for the cameras, just for her. He told her, "You've always looked beautiful in my designs. I wanted you to have one more." Audrey cried, not from sadness, but from gratitude for this person who had loved her so completely for so long. She wore that dress for a family photo taken just weeks before her death. In the photo, she looks frail but peaceful, and she's wearing Givenchy, as she had for 40 years. On January 20th, 1993, Audrey died at home, surrounded by her family. Givenchy was not there. Audrey had wanted only immediate family at the very end. But he was in constant contact, waiting for news. When he received the call that she was gone, he locked himself in his Paris apartment for 3 days. Wouldn't see anyone. Wouldn't answer calls. just grieved in private for the woman who had defined his life. His assistant, who finally convinced him to open the door, found him sitting in his studio, surrounded by sketches of Audrey, designs from throughout their 40-year collaboration. He looked up and said, "She was my everything. How do I design for a world without her?" Audrey's funeral was held on January 24, 1993, in the small church in Tolochenaz, Switzerland. Only close family and friends were invited. Givenchy attended, dressed impeccably as always. But those who were there said he looked devastated, empty. He sat quietly through the service, didn't speak, didn't cry publicly, just sat with his grief, private to the end. After the service, as guests were leaving, Givenchy approached Audrey's coffin one final time. He placed his hand on it gently and stood there for several minutes. A photographer captured this moment. In the photo, Givenchy's face is composed, but his body language reveals everything. The slight curve of his shoulders, the tender way his hand rests on the coffin. It's the posture of someone saying goodbye to their person. Later, at the reception, several people tried to comfort Givenchy, but he politely deflected. This was not a grief he wanted to share or perform. It was too personal, too deep. He left Switzerland that same day and returned to Paris, to the life that would never be the same. After Audrey's death, Givenchy continued working, continued creating. But something fundamental had changed. He rarely gave interviews. When he did, he'd steer conversations away from Audrey. Not because he didn't want to remember her, but because the grief was too raw, too personal to share with strangers. In 1995, he retired from fashion at age 68, earlier than expected. When asked why, he gave vague answers about wanting to enjoy life. But those close to him knew the real reason. Designing had lost its meaning without Audrey to dress. He spent his retirement years at his chateau in France, gardening and living quietly. His home was filled with photographs of Audrey. In his designs, at his shows, at private moments they'd shared. He never married, never had another significant relationship. Some have said he was married to his work, but really, he was devoted to a memory. In 2017, at age 91, Givenchy finally gave a rare interview where he spoke openly about Audrey. He was asked if he'd loved her. His response, "I created for her. I designed for her. I lived to see her beautiful. If that's not love, I don't know what is." When asked if he regretted that they'd never become romantic partners, he paused for a long time. Finally, he said, "We had something that lasted 40 years without diminishing. Something that never became ordinary or disappointing. Perhaps that's better than romance. Perhaps what we had was the truest form of love, one that asked nothing and gave everything." Hubert de Givenchy died on March 10th, 2018, at age 91. 25 years after Audrey, in his will, he left specific instructions. He was to be buried with a photograph of Audrey Hepburn, a sketch he'd made of her in 1953, and a letter she'd written to him in 1992. The contents of that letter have never been revealed. It remains private, even in death. For 40 years, Audrey Hepburn and Hubert de Givenchy had a relationship that defied every conventional category. They were not lovers. They were not just friends. They were not merely professional collaborators. They were something else, something we don't have a good word for in English. A bond so deep, so intimate, so enduring that it transcended the need for physical expression or official labels. They were two souls who recognized each other completely, who brought out the best in each other, who chose each other every day for 4 decades. Was it love? Absolutely. But not love as we typically define it. This was love without possession, love without jealousy, love that existed alongside marriages and relationships and careers, but remained untouched by any of it. In some ways, what they had was more powerful than romance. Romance ends. Passion fades. But what Audrey and Givenchy built, that lasted until death and beyond. Think about it. Givenchy lived for 25 years after Audrey died. 25 years when he could have married, could have found someone else, could have filled his life with new relationships. He didn't. Because what he had with Audrey was irreplaceable. And he chose to honor that by remaining devoted to her memory. Some might see that as tragic. A man who gave his whole heart to someone he never truly had. But maybe it's beautiful instead. Maybe spending your life devoted to one person, even if that devotion was never consummated, is one of the purest expressions of love. Hollywood wants us to believe in romantic love stories with happy endings. But the real love stories are often more complicated, more nuanced, more heartbreaking and beautiful than any script. Audrey and Givenchy's story is one of those. A 40-year love affair that never became a love affair. A relationship that everyone could see, but no one could quite define. Two people who meant everything to each other without ever admitting what that meant. And now, 25 years after Audrey's death and 5 years after Givenchy's, they're both gone. But the dresses remain. The photographs remain. The evidence of a love so powerful it transformed both fashion and film. Maybe that's the real legacy. Not the clothes themselves, but what those clothes represented. One person seeing another person completely and dedicating their art to honoring that vision. That's love, even if it never had a name.